Good evening, fellow ghouls, and thanks for stopping by on this stormy evening. Yes, as you can see, I'm still being held prisoner here at Litchfield Asylum. I'm not sure what's going on or who's in charge. Those demented creatures threw me in my own padded cell and haven't said a word to me. I'm not so sure they can even talk at all. It's funny. Every so often they let me out into this common area for some supervised time out of my straitjacket. They have some books lying around for patients to read, and one of them just happened to have some true scary stories in it. Would you like me to read one of these twisted tales of terror? Come, yes. Find somewhere to sit, get as comfortable as you can, and I'll tell you the tale of the cold shoulder. When I was in college, I took an elective course in sculpture. We had this month-long mini-semester in January, during which students were encouraged to take classes outside of their major. I was scrolling through the school website when I landed on Intro to Sculpture. I wasn't particularly interested in three-dimensional art, or even two-dimensional art for that matter, but I heard it was an easy course to pass. My friend had taken it prior to me and said that if you put in any kind of effort at all, the teacher, a chill old guy who'd been around forever, would give you an A. I'd had an intense fall semester, and coming off my winter break, an easy A sounded like the perfect way to ease into the new year. When the first day of class came, I had to go to a new part of town to find the sculpture building. My college didn't have a typically centralized campus. It was fairly spread out over the small town that it was in. Different departments had buildings in different areas, and a network of buses was almost always running, carrying students to and fro if their schedule demanded it. I'd used the university bus system before, but only a handful of times. I had been pretty lucky to have most of my classes within a stone's throw of one another. Looking up the address for the sculpture building, though, I realized that I'd have to ride one of the school buses pretty far out. I got up early on the first day of class just to make sure I'd catch it. It was a cold January day, and a light flurry of snow fell on the window as I rode the bus. I got off where Google Maps said I should, and saw the sculpture building for the first time. It was not exactly what I'd been expecting. Before me was an old-looking house. It had off-white wooden siding and a large bay window over the doorway on the second story. Now, this wasn't entirely unusual, as my college used many different buildings throughout the town. Much of the student housing, for example, was actually old houses that had been repurposed into dorms. My English class met in a building that looked much like this one. I was surprised, however, to see that sculpture would be meeting in a place that looked quite so domestic. I had pictured a more open, workshop-type space. I marched up the walkway to the house, the snow coming down a bit harder now, and turning into more of a freezing rain. I saw my college's crest on a sign next to the house and figured that I must be in the right place. Just then, a voice called to me from over my shoulder. I turned around to see a girl from my year standing on the walkway. "You here for sculpture?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Is this the spot?" "That's just the department offices," she informed me. "The studio's around back." I followed her back down the walkway, and she showed me to a stone path that ran alongside the house. My name's Claire. You've never taken a sculpture class before, huh? She inquired. Oh, well, no, not quite. I stammered, wondering if she was really into 3D art, and not quite wanting to tell her that I was just there for the credit. Let me guess, she continued. You're just here for the A. That's okay. Me too. We laughed together as the stone path took us around back behind the large house to reveal the studio, a one-story brick building I would best describe as a decent-sized garage. The studio looked as old as the main house did, and it was actually connected to it on the back side. Huh. Interesting place, I observed. Oh, you haven't heard about it before? She asked. I've got some stories for you. I wondered what she meant, but before I could ask, we entered through a side door into the studio building. Inside were 6 long tables with stools all around. A few other students were scattered among them. In the back of the studio were 2 large, shallow, rectangular sinks. To their left was a massive shelf full of tools and materials. Saws, screwdrivers, clay, fabric, wires, cardboard, wood. It was a conspicuously disorganized array of supplies. Scrappy-looking fluorescent light fixtures hung above each table, bathing the space in a vaguely green light that was a little off-putting, to be honest. I sat with Claire at one of the tables as the teacher, Mr. Massey, approached from the entrance that connected to the house. He introduced himself to the class, laid some of the ground rules for studio use, and gave us a brief intro to the world of sculpture. My friend had been right. Mr. Massey looked about 90 years old, was constantly smiling, and didn't seem to care so much about what you made, as long as you gave it a shot. He then gave us our first assignment, due next week, in which he instructed us to sculpt a childhood memory. He said it could be as literal or as abstract as we desired. Lastly, he dismissed us early, telling us to go enjoy the snow. I was speechless. It was a dream class. On our way out, Mr. Massey gave each of us a copy of a key to the studio. With it, we'd be able to access the space at any time to work on our assignments. I walked out with Claire, laughing about how all the stories were true, and how Mr. Massey's class really had earned its reputation. I went to wait for the bus, but Claire went in the opposite direction. She said she lived close by. I rode the bus all the way back through the freezing rain to my dorm and took a nice, long nap. Now, the thing about a blow-off class is that you tend to, well, blow it off until the last minute. True to form, I waited 5 days and then spent the 6th wondering just how in the hell I was going to sculpt a childhood memory. Lying on my dorm room bed, I tried to peer back as far as I could remember. I must have sat there for at least an hour before something hit me. It was a bit hazy, but I could recall finding a praying mantis on the playground as a kid. It was the playground at my primary school, so I had to have been only a few years old. I couldn't recall what happened before or after in the slightest, but I could picture this large praying mantis dancing on the wood chips as I watched. Okay, perfect, I thought. That will do. By the time I thought of my idea and grabbed the bus back over to the sculpture studio, it was maybe 6 in the evening. The sun was setting earlier in the cold winter months, and as such it was already very dark outside. I got out at the old white house and followed the stone path around the side to the garage studio connected to the back of the building. As I entered the studio, I was surprised to see only one other person at the tables, someone from the class who I had seen but not met. They gave me a slight nod to acknowledge my presence, but went back to their project immediately, some sort of cardboard contraption that I couldn't even begin to decipher. Normally I would have started some conversation, but they had headphones on and seemed to be giving off the general vibe of "leave me alone." I went over to the supplies shelf next to the sink and looked for some items that I could use to sculpt my praying mantis. Eventually, I found some decent-sized pieces of styrofoam and wire. There was also an old X-Acto knife lying on the shelf. I decided that I could carve the praying mantis's head and body out of the styrofoam and then add some of the wire to make its skinny little legs. I sat down at one of the other tables and started to carve out the styrofoam. The X-Acto knife didn't seem to be exactly the right tool for the job, as the foam kept breaking off in chunks, making it hard to control the shape of my sculpture too precisely. Oh well, I thought, Mr. Massey said it could be abstract. After a few minutes of working, the other student packed up their things and left, leaving me alone in the studio. It was so quiet in the space, and after a while, being alone made the quiet start to feel a bit eerie. I pulled out my iPod and put on some music while I worked. A few minutes later, I thought I heard someone's voice coming from behind me. It sounded like it had come from the direction of the materials shelf, next to those old-looking sinks. You know when you're listening to a song on headphones and sometimes you think maybe you hear someone talking to you, and you can't tell if it's in the song or in real life? Yeah, this was one of those times. I pulled off my headphones and listened. Nothing. It was still quiet. I put them back on and continued my work. But a few moments later, it happened again. I could swear I heard someone saying something. It definitely sounded like it had come from behind me. But then I wondered if sound from outside or the house next door just happened to echo around this space in a weird way. Oh no, I thought. Maybe someone forgot their key and is trying to get in. I got up from my table and walked over to the door, pushing it open and immediately feeling the rush of the cold winter night air. It was perfectly still outside and ice cold. I looked left, then right. If someone had been trying to get in, they weren't trying anymore. Starting to shiver in the cold, I shut the door and returned to my desk. Things were calm for about an hour or so. I remember listening to quite a bit of music, when suddenly someone came up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder. In the instant that it happened, my mind moved quickly, figuring that it was Claire, the only person who I knew in the class that was at all friendly with me like that. But when I turned around, there was nobody there. Nobody there at all. The studio was still empty apart from me. I jumped up from my stool and ripped off my headphones. I had felt it. There was no mistaking it. 2 taps on my left shoulder. It couldn't have been someone messing with me. I'd turned around too quickly, and the studio was too open. There was nowhere where someone could have hidden that quickly. I stared for a moment in the direction the taps had come from, over my shoulder. It was again back towards the material shelf and the 2 large, flat sinks by the wall. Forget this, I thought to myself. My sculpture looks enough like a praying mantis. I gathered my things and packed to leave. I threw the extra styrofoam and wire back on the shelf and practically power walked out of the studio, closing the garage entrance behind me. I walked a few extra blocks alone in the dark, preferring to take the bus from the next stop rather than to wait alone outside that spooky studio. The next day I remembered something that Claire had told me before the first day of class. When I had commented on the strange layout of the garage and its connection to the White House, she had said, "Oh, you don't know about this place? I have some stories." As we were leaving class the next day, I asked her about it. "Oh, yeah," she said. "So the word on the street is that the old White House used to be a funeral home before the university bought it. The garage is connected to the house because it used to be the embalming room." My stomach dropped. "You're kidding me," I said. I don't know how true it is, Claire admitted, but that's what people say. You know those two big flat sinks next to the shelf? Those are old embalming tables. My stomach somehow dropped even further. Yeah, Claire continued, people say that sometimes if you're here late at night, weird stuff happens. It's supposedly haunted. Anyway, I enjoyed the rest of my time in the sculpture class. Mr. Massey was nice, and I did have some fun learning how to use different materials more precisely. True to his reputation, I got an A at the end of the short semester. I did do my own digging into the history of the old White House and the connected garage. Turns out, it was apparently a funeral home back in its day. The stuff about the garage being the embalming room and the sinks being the embalming tables, though, those remained rumors that I could never verify. I do know one thing, though. I never put another assignment off to the last minute again, and made sure to work in that studio in broad daylight with plenty of other people around. Another twisted tale of terror, fellow ghouls. Can you imagine finding out that you were actually washing your hands at an old embalming table? That would certainly give me a sinking feeling. Well, I guess that's all for now. Seems like it's time for me to return to my cell. I have to figure out how to escape from here. Do you have any ideas? If not, at least come back and see me again sometime soon. I'll have another true scary story waiting for you. Good night.